Mention Ebola and you get a lot of fear and often a flurry of terrified what-ifs. What if it mutates? What if it starts to spread through airborne transmission? Could this become a viral threat to civilization at large? Well, this is not that video. That's my next video because I know many people are interested in these questions. In the meantime, there are other Ebola scenarios that do worry me, and I'm going to get to those in a few minutes. But first, some context. So recently, Ebola spread into Uganda, with 3 cases announced in a family that had crossed from the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is of course of great concern. This deadly disease appearing in a new country, the outbreak extending beyond its previous geographical range. Although at the time I made this video, there were no additional cases in Uganda, though sadly the 3 individuals who contracted this deadly disease all perished. But for many, the news of the spread of Ebola virus disease to Uganda may have been their first awareness of an outbreak of Ebola that has been out of control in neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo since August of 2018. Would it surprise you to learn that the current outbreak in Congo is the second most deadly in history, behind only the West African epidemic of 2014 to 2016, which killed over 11,000 people? To date, there have been more than 2,200 cases in the Democratic Republic of Congo and 1,500 deaths. Why is this outbreak relatively little known? Especially when Ebola is a disease with very significant mortality, with a case fatality rate of perhaps 60 to 90% in the strain causing this outbreak, the Ebola Zaire strain. And when fear of Ebola in past outbreaks has been intense, probably partly because until the announcement of spread to a neighboring country, the outbreak has been confined to a large but remote region of the world in eastern Congo. Looking at this map of Central Africa, you can see the location of the North Kivu and Ituri provinces in far eastern Congo where the cases have occurred. The provinces are deep within Central Africa, not easy to access from outside the region, though they do border Uganda and Rwanda to the east and South Sudan to the far northeast. There is another fact that is also relatively little known, and it's not coincidental to the relatively little known Ebola outbreak. That's the fact that this region is part of an armed conflict, ongoing with varying intensity for 25 years, with dozens of armed groups. It's a war zone. In fact, the UN peacekeeping mission in eastern Congo is the largest peacekeeping mission in the world. There's no centralized government control in these areas. The DRC doesn't have control. And people have been dying of malaria, war, and neglect long before they started contracting Ebola. But all of a sudden we have a new situation. Never before has an Ebola outbreak occurred in a war zone. Compound this with a distrust of foreign health workers, perhaps part of an overall mistrust of authority in the region in general, and people are reluctant to go to treatment centers. Containment of the outbreak relies on getting people to safe settings where they can receive supportive care and treatment, and cutting off further contamination. The disease is spread because the virus replicates itself and then causes vomiting, bloody diarrhea, and hemorrhage, which are then transmitted by direct contact, usually to family members and caregivers. Without the use of the kind of care and precautions available at dedicated treatment centers, the virus is much more likely to perpetuate itself. Further complicating the situation is that for unknown reasons, treatment centers and treatment workers have been targeted by militia groups. 2 centers operated by Doctors Without Borders have been burned to the ground in recent months, forcing the group to stop supporting local treatment facilities and to withdraw personnel on the ground. And dozens of other health workers have been attacked. The risk of transmission is very high in dealing with the bodies of the recently deceased. The corpses contain infectious viral particles in blood and other bodily fluids. And so crucial to containing the outbreak are safe burial teams, teams that can bury the dead using safe practices. And these teams too have been subject to attack. War and infectious disease are traditional partners. A classic example is the 1918 avian flu pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu, which started during World War I. This disease infected 500 million people and killed 50 to 100 million. The pandemic began 9 months before the end of that massive conflict. Soldiers lived in close proximity to one another, and there were unprecedented numbers of troops moving, coughing, spreading airborne viral particles to the benefit of the virus and to the great detriment of human beings. War again is playing a major role in the current Ebola outbreak and hampering efforts to get it under control. As in the avian flu World War I case, people in the DRC are on the move, fleeing danger, seeking to avoid being caught up in the fighting. Now there is a powerful tool available in this outbreak that wasn't available during the West African epidemic of 2014 to 2016. There are now vaccines available that appear to be highly effective if given in advance. Over 100,000 people have been vaccinated in Congo, but vaccination without isolation of the sick and careful tracking of contacts, potentially using ring vaccination, vaccinating the contacts of the infected and then the contacts of the contacts, is not sufficient to stop new infections. And tracking cases in a war zone, in a population suspicious of healthcare workers, well, you can see the difficulty. In Uganda, 4,000 health workers were vaccinated in advance. Uganda has been concerned about the possibility of cross-border infections since the outbreak began. Hundreds or thousands of people cross the border every day. Uganda has mounted a robust response. In addition to vaccinating many healthcare workers in advance, Ebola treatment units are in place in Uganda in the districts bordering North Kivu and Ituri. Disease monitoring has been intensified at all border crossings, including retaining individuals who show a fever and monitoring them until it's been determined whether or not they have the disease. The contacts of the affected individuals have been located and vaccinated. This is not to say that Congo has not attempted to do the same. But conditions in Congo, those of war, disarray, and distrust, have made the reasonable public health responses in Uganda ineffective in Congo. My favorite infectious disease science journalist, maybe everyone's favorite, Laurie Garrett, was quoted in Time magazine summarizing it this way: "It's not biology. It has nothing to do whatsoever with biology. This is a 100% military political set of obstacles. The issue is that the people trying to stop the epidemic are being shot at." So now we come to the problems that I worry about. First, can the Congo outbreak be brought under control under the current conditions? And what are the implications if it cannot? The World Health Organization in their May 9th report clearly states that containment is unlikely if attacks against Ebola response teams do not cease. And who will bring about such a cessation? And how? In November, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director Robert Redfield said that the Ebola outbreak in Congo is so difficult that we must consider the possibility that it cannot be brought under control and instead will become entrenched. Wow. That would be an unprecedented development and would mean that the traditional ways of bringing an outbreak under control, tracing contacts, stopping the chain of transmission, would not be possible. And second, then what happens to this vast region? North Kivu and Ituri are home to 10 million people. What about trade and travel in the region, let alone an uncontrollable epidemic affecting a large population, and vastly more likely to spread beyond the region? And what alterations might we see in the virus if it's allowed a sustained presence and transmission in human hosts. There are major cities in the region, with connections to places much more widespread than isolated rural locations have. Places like Goma, with 1 million people, and Butembo, Bunia, and to the south, Bukavu, with 870,000 people, not to mention the rest of Congo to the west, total population 92 million people, and the countries to the immediate east, Rwanda, Uganda, and South Sudan. An endemic Ebola would become a public health disaster on a massive scale. It's almost cliché to speak of the need for more international assistance and funding. Certainly those are desperate needs. And for more training of local personnel to coordinate Ebola response teams. But it is not clear whether anyone has the ability or the will to do what's necessary in this troubled region. And so we have an unprecedented situation. A deadly virus, controllable by conventional means, with effective vaccines as a powerful additional tool, which through human folly may result in a new and uncontrollable epidemic or pandemic, with all the death and misery that entails, to say nothing of the unpredictability for the world. In this sense, I'd like to hope that even if the headline, Ebola spreads to Uganda, describes something that is quickly and effectively contained, at least it may have the effect of awakening a sleeping world to a public health disaster no longer so easily relegated to a remote region that to many may not seem to much matter. As promised, stay tuned next time for my take on a question very often asked: could Ebola mutate into something much more transmissible, placing the world at risk of viral catastrophe? See you then. For now, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification button. Thanks a lot for watching.